Ladies and gentlemen, the question we face today is both urgent and unsettling. Can we trust big tech to keep our kids safe? This is not a hypothetical concern. It is the daily reality for millions of families navigating a digital world where screens are ubiquitous and algorithms are invisible. Every day, children interact with platforms designed to capture attention, not always to protect well-being. The companies behind these platforms claim to safeguard our youngest users, yet the evidence raises difficult questions. Are content filters truly effective? Are privacy protections enforced consistently? And most importantly, are the incentives of these corporations aligned with the safety of our children or with engagement metrics and profit margins that often reward risk and controversy? The stakes could not be higher. Online spaces shape social development, influence behavior, and expose children to both overt and subtle forms of harm, from cyberbullying to predatory content, from disinformation to addictive design. Every interaction has potential consequences, and yet the mechanisms of oversight remain opaque. Big tech has vast technological capabilities, but the deployment of these tools for protection is inconsistent at best. Platforms often rely on automated moderation, AI algorithms that misclassify content, and reactive reporting systems, leaving gaps through which harm can slip unnoticed. Meanwhile, the companies themselves maintain control over the data and the rules, creating a dynamic where accountability is difficult to enforce. It is also important to recognize the tension between corporate interest and public trust. These platforms generate billions in revenue by maximizing engagement, and children are among the most impressionable and responsive users. Incentives to prioritize safety over engagement exist, but they are often secondary to the primary goal of growth and monetization. This conflict is not always deliberate malice, it is structural, yet it demonstrates why trusting corporations without oversight or enforceable standards is inherently risky. Parents, educators, and regulators increasingly question whether voluntary safeguards are sufficient or whether more stringent measures are needed to ensure that children are genuinely protected. The question ultimately extends beyond technology itself to the responsibilities of society. Regulators, policymakers, and families must ask hard questions about transparency, accountability, and enforceable standards. Can a platform designed to optimize attention be expected to also act as a reliable guardian? Can algorithms calibrated for engagement adequately recognize nuanced risks to child safety? The answers are not straightforward, but the need for clarity, oversight, and ethical accountability is undeniable. As we navigate this digital landscape, it is imperative to remember that safety is not just a technical problem. It is a societal responsibility. Trust cannot be assumed simply because a company promises protection. It must be earned through consistent, verifiable action, transparent practices, and meaningful oversight. Only then can we begin to ensure that the digital world becomes a place where children can explore, learn, and connect without unnecessary risk, and where the tools we entrust with their care align with our collective responsibility to protect the next generation. The digital world exposes children to risks daily, and big tech platforms designed to capture attention often prioritize engagement over protection. The digital landscape in which children now grow up is unprecedented in both scale and complexity, exposing them to risks that previous generations could scarcely imagine. From social media platforms to video sharing apps, gaming communities, and chat-based networks, children are interacting daily with technologies designed to maximize attention and engagement. While these platforms often market themselves as spaces for learning, connection, and entertainment, the underlying architecture prioritizes user retention and monetization above all else. Algorithms are calibrated to surface content that elicits emotional responses, encourages longer screen time, and increases interaction, often without adequate consideration for age-appropriate suitability or potential psychological impact. For children, whose cognitive and emotional faculties are still developing, the effects of this environment can be particularly pronounced. The risks embedded in these digital interactions are multidimensional. Exposure to inappropriate or harmful content, the pressures of social comparison, cyberbullying, and the normalization of risky behaviors all constitute threats to mental, emotional, and social development. Platforms often fail to distinguish between content that is potentially informative or harmless and content that may be manipulative, exploitative, or damaging. Automated content moderation systems, while improving in sophistication, remain limited in understanding context, nuance, and intent. As a result, even well-intentioned safety mechanisms allow harmful material to slip through the cracks, creating an environment in which children are vulnerable to both overt and subtle forms of harm. The architecture of engagement itself is another vector of concern. Features such as infinite scrolling, push notifications, algorithmically curated recommendations, and gamified reward systems exploit psychological triggers that are particularly potent in younger users. While these mechanisms are highly effective in sustaining user attention, they may also encourage compulsive behavior, reduce attention spans, and contribute to difficulties in regulating emotional and cognitive responses. The intersection of profit motives and design choices creates a structural vulnerability. Platforms generate revenue from prolonged engagement, yet extended exposure often increases children's susceptibility to inappropriate content and adverse experiences. Moreover, the lack of transparency in how platforms operate compounds these risks. Children, parents, and even educators are often unable to discern the criteria by which content is recommended, filtered, or removed. This opacity makes it difficult to assess the actual level of protection or to hold companies accountable for failures in safeguarding young users. While big tech companies assert that they are committed to child safety, the incentives embedded within their business models frequently conflict with the rigorous implementation of protective measures. As a result, the question of trust becomes central. Can platforms designed primarily for engagement and profit genuinely act in the best interest of children who rely on them daily? Current safety measures such as AI moderation, content filters, and reporting systems are inconsistent and leave significant gaps in protecting children online. Current safety measures implemented by big tech to protect children online, while often touted as robust, remain inconsistent and incomplete, leaving significant gaps that can expose young users to harm. Platforms employ a range of strategies, including artificial intelligence-driven content moderation, algorithmic filtering, and user reporting systems, but these mechanisms have inherent limitations. Automated systems, for instance, rely on pattern recognition and predefined rules to flag or remove inappropriate material. While effective at scale, they often struggle to interpret context, nuance, or the evolving ways in which harmful content is presented. This results in both false negatives, where dangerous content slips through, and false positives, where benign content is incorrectly restricted, creating confusion for users and parents alike. Content filters, another commonly deployed tool, face similar challenges. They are designed to screen for explicit language, graphic imagery, or certain keywords, yet children encounter risks that are far more subtle, such as manipulative messaging, predatory interactions, or psychologically damaging material that does not trigger standard filters. The scope of content that must be monitored is vast and constantly evolving, making comprehensive coverage nearly impossible without human oversight. However, human moderation is resource-intensive and often subject to limitations in scale, training, and cultural sensitivity, leading to inconsistent enforcement across different platforms and regions. Reporting systems, while empowering users and parents to flag inappropriate content, are reactive rather than proactive. Children must recognize and identify harmful interactions before they are mitigated, which is particularly challenging for younger users who may lack the experience or judgment to assess risk. Even when reports are submitted, the response time and effectiveness of enforcement vary widely, creating windows of exposure during which harm can occur. Additionally, reliance on parental oversight is often insufficient, as not all guardians possess the technological literacy or time to monitor online behavior continuously, leaving children vulnerable in moments of unsupervised engagement. The combined effect of these limitations is structural vulnerability. Platforms may appear to offer safeguards, but the uneven implementation and reliance on imperfect technologies mean that gaps persist. Children's exposure to risk is not an occasional failure, but a predictable outcome of the design and operational constraints of current safety measures. While improvements are continually introduced, the scale, complexity, and profit-driven incentives of digital platforms mean that these measures alone cannot guarantee comprehensive protection, highlighting the urgent need for independent oversight, clear accountability standards, and systemic approaches to child safety in the digital environment. There is an inherent and persistent tension between the profit motives of big tech companies and their ethical responsibility to protect children, a tension that makes voluntary safety measures inherently insufficient. These platforms generate revenue primarily through user engagement, advertising, and data collection, and children represent a particularly responsive demographic whose attention can be monetized effectively. Features designed to capture and retain attention, including recommendation algorithms, notifications, and gamified elements, are calibrated not for safety or developmental benefit, but for maximizing time spent on the platform. While companies may publicly commit to protecting young users, the underlying business model often rewards behavior that increases exposure to risks, creating a structural conflict between financial incentives and child safety obligations. This tension is compounded by the opacity of corporate operations. Decisions about what constitutes harmful content, how moderation is enforced, and the effectiveness of protective mechanisms are largely controlled internally with limited external verification. Without transparent reporting and independent oversight, it is difficult to determine whether measures implemented in the name of child safety are meaningful or primarily performative. Voluntary initiatives such as parental controls, content warnings, and educational campaigns are valuable but cannot compensate for the systemic incentive to prioritize engagement over protection. Even sophisticated tools cannot entirely neutralize the impact of design choices that encourage prolonged exposure or incentivize risk-laden interactions. The misalignment between profit and protection becomes particularly apparent in the subtle ways in which platforms operate. For example, algorithms may prioritize sensational or emotionally provocative content because it generates engagement, even when such content may be inappropriate or psychologically harmful to children. Similarly, features that encourage repeated interactions, such as streaks, challenges, or virtual rewards, exploit cognitive and emotional vulnerabilities, amplifying the potential for compulsive usage. These design choices are rarely accidental. They reflect deliberate strategies to maximize revenue, and yet they carry consequences that are disproportionately borne by young users who are less able to regulate attention or assess risk. The structural nature of this conflict underscores why relying solely on voluntary safeguards is inadequate. Even well-intentioned companies face systemic pressures that make comprehensive protection difficult to achieve without enforceable standards. Regulators, parents, and educators cannot assume that safety measures implemented by platforms will align with the best interests of children, particularly when those measures conflict with the financial imperatives that drive platform design and operation. Addressing this gap requires interventions that go beyond self-regulation, incorporating independent oversight, accountability mechanisms, and enforceable obligations that align corporate behavior with the ethical imperative to protect young users in the digital environment. Trusting big tech to protect children cannot rely solely on corporate promises. It requires transparency, accountability, and enforceable standards that ensure safety measures are consistently implemented and independently verified. While companies frequently emphasize voluntary initiatives, such as content moderation systems, parental controls, or educational campaigns, the effectiveness of these measures is difficult to assess without clear metrics and open reporting. Transparency is essential because it allows parents, educators, and regulators to understand how content is filtered, how harmful material is identified and removed, and how algorithms determine what children are exposed to. Without visibility into these processes, assurances from companies remain largely unverifiable, creating a significant gap between stated intentions and actual practice. Accountability is equally critical. Platforms operate with enormous influence over children's digital experiences, yet there are limited mechanisms to hold companies responsible when failures occur. Harmful content can persist for hours, days, or longer, and reactive systems such as reporting and human moderation often fail to address risks in a timely manner. In many cases, companies face minimal consequences for lapses, particularly when policies are inconsistently applied across regions or user demographics. Effective accountability requires independent oversight bodies or regulatory frameworks capable of enforcing safety standards, evaluating compliance, and imposing penalties for negligence or systematic failures. This ensures that commitments to child safety are not merely aspirational but operationally meaningful and legally binding. Enforceable standards are necessary because voluntary measures alone are insufficient to overcome the structural incentives inherent in platform design. Engagement-driven models reward prolonged usage, rapid content circulation, and algorithmically amplified material, some of which may be harmful to young users. Even with the best intentions, voluntary policies are often compromised by these systemic pressures. Enforceable rules, codified through legislation or industry-wide agreements, create external constraints that align corporate behavior with ethical obligations. They establish baseline expectations for content moderation, algorithmic transparency, age-appropriate design, and timely responses to reported harms. Such standards reduce the reliance on corporate discretion and ensure that child safety is treated as a non-negotiable priority rather than a secondary consideration. Ultimately, trust in big tech's ability to protect children is conditional. It cannot be granted based solely on promises, statements, or internal policies. It must be earned through demonstrable actions that are transparent, accountable, and enforceable. Only when systems exist to independently verify compliance, address failures, and ensure that protective measures are consistently applied can parents, educators, and society reasonably expect that digital platforms will fulfill their ethical responsibility to safeguard young users from harm. Ensuring child safety in digital spaces is not solely the responsibility of technology companies. It is a collective obligation that requires coordinated effort among parents, educators, policymakers, and the platforms themselves. While companies design and operate the environments in which children interact, they cannot act in isolation, and reliance on corporate self-regulation is insufficient to address the multifaceted risks inherent in online engagement. Parents must be informed, vigilant, and empowered to guide their children's digital experiences, providing oversight, setting boundaries, and cultivating critical awareness of online risks. Education plays a crucial role in equipping children with the skills to navigate online spaces safely, including understanding privacy, recognizing manipulation, and exercising judgment in interactions with content and other users. Policymakers and regulatory bodies also play an indispensable role in establishing frameworks that ensure consistent protection. Voluntary measures, while valuable, cannot compensate for the structural incentives within profit-driven platforms that prioritize engagement over safety. Enforceable legislation, standards for age-appropriate design, requirements for transparency, and mechanisms for accountability are all necessary to create an environment in which child safety is systematically embedded rather than dependent on individual corporate discretion. By establishing clear rules, authorities provide a baseline of protection that reduces ambiguity and ensures that companies cannot selectively enforce safeguards based on market incentives or internal priorities. At the same time, collaboration between stakeholders enhances efficacy. Platforms can provide tools and features that support parental oversight and educational efforts, while independent organizations and civil society groups can audit systems, report failures, and advocate for continuous improvement. The collective responsibility model recognizes that no single actor has complete control over the digital environment, and that shared governance is essential to mitigate complex and evolving risks. It also acknowledges that children's exposure to digital content is continuous, contextual, and highly individualized, requiring adaptive and multi-layered protective strategies rather than one-size-fits-all solutions. This integrated approach emphasizes that ethical oversight and consistent action must take precedence over profit-driven algorithms and engagement metrics. Digital platforms wield unprecedented influence over the cognitive, emotional, and social development of young users, and safeguarding these populations requires a proactive, coordinated strategy. Reliance solely on technological solutions or corporate assurances fails to address the systemic pressures that incentivize risk exposure. By combining informed parental guidance, educational initiatives, robust regulatory frameworks, and corporate accountability, Society can create a digital ecosystem in which children are protected, empowered, and able to benefit from the opportunities of technology without being subjected to avoidable harm. The responsibility for child safety is therefore distributed across multiple actors, and its success depends on alignment, transparency, and sustained commitment. Protecting children online is not merely a technical problem. It is an ethical imperative that demands vigilance, collaboration, and enforceable action at every level of interaction.